The discovery. The rain fell in a steady drizzle, turning the trenches into a quagmire of mud and despair. Private James Calloway wiped the grime from his face, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the strap of his helmet. The Great War had dragged on for years, and the once idealistic young man who had enlisted with dreams of glory now felt like a ghost, a mere shadow of his former self. The trenches were a living hell, a place where men were ground down by the relentless machinery of war, their spirits broken by the constant shelling, the rats, and the ever-present stench of death. James had been assigned to a section of the front that had seen little action in recent months. The fighting had moved elsewhere, leaving this stretch of no man's land eerily quiet. The silence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the chaos he had grown accustomed to. As he patrolled the trench, his boots squelching in the mud, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension, as if the very earth beneath his feet was holding its breath. It was during one of these patrols that James stumbled upon the diary. He had been inspecting a section of the trench that had collapsed during a recent bombardment, his flashlight casting long shadows on the crumbling walls. As he poked through the debris, something caught his eye. A small, leather-bound book, its cover stained and cracked with age. He picked it up, brushing away the dirt, and felt a shiver run down his spine. The diary was old, much older than the war itself, and yet it had been buried here, in this forgotten corner of the battlefield. James opened the diary, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, the ink faded but still legible. The entries were dated 1916, written by a soldier named Lieutenant Edward Hargrove. As James read, his heart began to race. The diary described a battle that had taken place in this very spot, a battle that had been erased from history. According to Hargrove, the fighting had been unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The enemy had unleashed a weapon of unimaginable power, a device that could level entire battalions in an instant. The weapon had been buried, hidden away to keep it from falling into the wrong hands, but Hargrove's final entry hinted that it was still active, lying dormant beneath the earth, waiting to be awakened. James closed the diary, his mind reeling. He had heard stories of secret weapons, of course, every soldier had, but this was different. The diary felt real, too real to be dismissed as mere fantasy. And yet, if such a weapon existed, why had no one ever heard of it? Why had the battle been forgotten, erased from history as if it had never happened? As the rain continued to fall, James made a decision. He would investigate, he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The diary had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. The weapon was out there, buried beneath the mud and the blood, and it was his duty to ensure it stayed that way. But as he tucked the diary into his coat and turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Somewhere, deep beneath the earth, something stirred, awakened by the touch of human hands. The weapon was no longer dormant. It was waiting, the investigation. James returned to his bunk, the diary clutched tightly in his hands. The other soldiers were asleep, their snores filling the cramped space, but James couldn't rest. His mind raced with questions. Who was Lieutenant Edward Hargrove? Why had his diary been buried in the trench? And most importantly, what was this weapon he had described? The entries had been vague, filled with fear and desperation. But one thing was clear. The weapon was real, and it was dangerous. The next morning, James began his investigation. He started by asking around, discreetly probing his fellow soldiers for any information about the trench's history. Most of them shrugged, uninterested. The war had made them numb to stories of battles and weapons. But one man, an older soldier named Corporal Harris, seemed to know something. When James mentioned the diary, Harris's face darkened. "You shouldn't be digging into that," Harris said, his voice low. "Some things are better left buried." James pressed him, but Harris refused to say more. Instead, he warned James to leave it alone, his tone more serious than James had ever heard it. The warning only fueled James's curiosity. If Harris knew something, then there had to be others who did too. Over the next few days, James continued his search. He visited the regiment's archives, poring over old maps and records. The trench where he had found the diary was marked as a minor defensive position, with no significant battles recorded. But as James dug deeper, he found discrepancies. Some maps showed the trench as part of a larger network, one that had been hastily abandoned in 1916. Others listed it as classified, with no further details. James also learned more about Lieutenant Edward Hargrove. According to the records, Hargrove had been a promising officer, assigned to a special unit tasked with investigating experimental weapons. His file ended abruptly in 1916, with a single note, "Killed in action, details classified." There was no mention of the battle described in the diary, no record of the weapon. It was as if Hargrove and his unit had been erased from history. Determined to uncover the truth, James decided to return to the trench. He waited until nightfall when the other soldiers were asleep and slipped out of the bunker. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still slick with mud. The trench was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant rumble of artillery. James made his way to the collapsed section where he had found the diary, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he dug through the debris, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A metal hatch, partially buried in the mud. It was old and rusted, but still intact. James's heart pounded as he cleared away the dirt, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the earth. The hatch was heavy, but with some effort he managed to pry it open. A cold, damp breeze wafted up from below, carrying with it the faint smell of oil and decay. James hesitated. He knew he should report this, bring it to the attention of his superiors. But something told him they already knew. The classified records, Harris's warning, it all pointed to a cover-up. If he wanted answers, he would have to find them himself. Taking a deep breath, James descended the stairs. The tunnel was narrow, the walls lined with crumbling concrete. The air grew colder as he went deeper, the silence oppressive. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a large chamber. James's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The chamber was filled with strange machinery, rusted and covered in dust. In the center of the room was a massive device, unlike anything James had ever seen. It was cylindrical, with a series of pipes and valves running along its sides. The surface was etched with strange symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness. James approached the device, his breath catching in his throat. This had to be the weapon Hargrove had described. But how had it ended up here, buried beneath the battlefield? And why had it been left untouched for so long? As he examined the device, he noticed a control panel on one side. The buttons and switches were labeled in a language he didn't recognize, but one switch stood out. It was larger than the others, marked with a warning symbol. James's hand hovered over the switch, his mind racing. What would happen if he flipped it? Would the weapon activate, unleashing its power? Or would it destroy itself, taking him with it? Before he could decide, he heard a noise behind him. He turned, his flashlight illuminating the figure of Corporal Harris, standing in the entrance to the chamber. Harris's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I told you to leave it alone," Harris said, his voice trembling. "You don't know what you're dealing with." James took a step back, his heart pounding. "What is this thing?" he demanded. "Why was it buried here?" Harris shook his head. "It's not just a weapon. It's a mistake. A mistake they tried to bury, but it won't stay buried. It's awake now, and it's hungry." Before James could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake. The device in the center of the chamber hummed to life, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter. The air grew thick, charged with energy. Harris turned and ran, disappearing into the tunnel. James stood frozen, his mind racing. He had to do something. But what? If he left the weapon, it could fall into the wrong hands. But if he stayed, he might not survive. As the shaking intensified, James made his decision. He reached for the control panel, his fingers trembling as he flipped the switch. The hum grew louder, the light from the device blinding. James closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, the shaking stopped, the light dimmed, the device fell silent, the symbols fading back into darkness. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He had done it. He had stopped the weapon. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the floor, a piece of paper partially buried in the dust. He picked it up, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. It was a note, written in the same cramped handwriting as the diary. If you're reading this, then it's too late. The weapon is awake, and it cannot be stopped. It will consume everything unless you find the key. The key is the only way to destroy it. But beware, the key is not what it seems. James stared at the note, his mind reeling. The key? What key? And where was it? He had so many questions, but no time to answer them. The weapon was still active, and he had to find a way to stop it for good. As he climbed the stairs and emerged into the trench, he knew his journey was far from over. The weapon was out there, waiting to be unleashed, and he was the only one who could stop it. The key. James emerged from the underground chamber, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. The note he had found, scrawled in Lieutenant Hargrove's handwriting, haunted him. The key is the only way to destroy it. But what key? And where could it possibly be? The weapon was a monstrous enigma, a relic of a forgotten battle, and now it was his responsibility to ensure it never saw the light of day. The trench was eerily silent as James made his way back to the bunker. The rain had started again, a cold, relentless drizzle that seeped into his bones. He clutched the note tightly, his thoughts racing. If the key was the only way to destroy the weapon, then he had to find it, no matter the cost. But where to begin? The diary had been his only clue, and now it seemed even that was incomplete. When he returned to the bunker, the other soldiers were still asleep. James sat on his cot, staring at the note in the dim light of a flickering lantern. The words seemed to taunt him. The key is not what it seems. What did that mean? Was it a physical object or something more abstract? And how was he supposed to find it in the middle of a war zone? As dawn broke, James decided to seek out Corporal Harris. The older soldier had known something about the weapon, and if anyone could help him, it was Harris. But when James approached Harris's bunk, he found it empty. The other soldiers shrugged when asked about his whereabouts. Probably on patrol, one of them muttered, barely looking up. James's unease grew. Harris had been in the chamber with him, had seen the weapon. If he had fled, where had he gone? And why? James couldn't shake the feeling that Harris knew more than he was letting on. Determined to find answers, James decided to search the trench system for any sign of him. The search took most of the day. James combed through every section of the trench, asking anyone he encountered if they had seen Harris. Most hadn't, but one soldier recalled seeing him heading toward the supply depot earlier that morning. James made his way there, his boots squelching in the mud. The supply depot was a chaotic mess of crates, barrels, and equipment. Soldiers moved about, loading and unloading supplies, their faces grim and tired. James scanned the area, looking for any sign of Harris. As he rounded a stack of crates, he spotted him. Harris was crouched in a corner, rummaging through a battered satchel. His hands were shaking, his face pale and sweaty. "Harris," James called out, keeping his voice low. "We need to talk." Harris flinched, nearly dropping the satchel. He looked up at James, his eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "You don't understand what you're messing with." "Then explain it to me," James said, stepping closer. "What is that weapon? And what's this key Hargrove mentioned?" Harris hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, he sighed and gestured for James to follow him. They moved to a quieter corner of the depot, where Harris leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "The weapon, it's not just a machine," Harris said. "It's alive, or at least it was. They called it Project Ether, some kind of experimental energy source designed to end the war in one stroke. But it went wrong, started consuming everything, men, machines, even the ground itself. They had to bury it, seal it away. But it's still down there, waiting. James felt a chill run down his spine. And the key? What is it? Harris shook his head. I don't know exactly. Hargrove was the only one who knew, but he said it wasn't a physical object. It's a person. Someone with a specific connection to the weapon. Someone who can control it or destroy it. James frowned. A person? Who? Harris looked away, his expression grim. I don't know, but Hargrove believed the key was still out there somewhere. He said it was the only way to stop the weapon for good. James's mind raced. If the key was a person, then who could it be? Someone from Hargrove's unit? A scientist involved in the project? Or was it someone else entirely? The possibilities were endless, and time was running out. As James pondered his next move, a loud explosion shook the ground. The soldiers around them shouted in alarm, scrambling for cover. James and Harris ducked behind a stack of crates as another explosion rocked the depot. Through the chaos, James heard a voice shouting over the din. Gas attack! Gas attack! Panic spread through the depot as soldiers donned their gas masks. James grabbed one from a nearby crate and handed it to Harris, who was still trembling. As they secured their masks, James noticed something strange. The explosions weren't coming from the enemy lines. They were coming from underground. The weapon, it was active. We have to go, James said, pulling Harris to his feet. We need to find that key before it's too late. Harris nodded, though his eyes were filled with terror. Together, they made their way out of the depot, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The weapon was waking up, and if they didn't find the key soon, it would consume everything. As they ran through the trench, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, the air thick with an unnatural energy. Somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the weapon stirred, its power growing with each passing moment. James knew one thing for certain. The key was out there, and he would find it no matter what it took. The awakening. The trench was in chaos. Soldiers scrambled in every direction, their shouts muffled by gas masks as the ground continued to tremble. James and Harris pushed through the crowd, their boots slipping in the mud. The explosions had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. We need to get to higher ground, James said, his voice muffled by the mask. If the weapon is active, we're sitting ducks down here. Harris nodded, though his eyes were wide with fear. There's an observation post about half a mile east of here. It's abandoned, but it should give us a better view. They moved quickly, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. The trench system was a maze, but Harris seemed to know it well. As they navigated the narrow passages, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, and more than once he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. But every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. When they finally reached the observation post, James was relieved to find it empty. The small wooden structure was perched on a hill overlooking the battlefield, offering a clear view of the surrounding area. James scanned the horizon, his heart sinking as he saw the devastation. Craters dotted the landscape, their edges glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. The weapon was awake, and it was spreading. What do we do now? Harris asked, his voice trembling. If the key is a person, how are we supposed to find them? James didn't have an answer. The note from Hargrove had been vague, and Harris's explanation only raised more questions. If the key was someone with a connection to the weapon, then who could it be? Someone from Hargrove's unit? A scientist? Or was it someone else entirely? As James pondered the possibilities, he noticed something strange. The craters below seemed to be arranged in a pattern, their glowing edges forming a series of concentric circles. At the center of the pattern was a large, dark mound, the entrance to the underground chamber where he had found the weapon. Look at that, James said, pointing. The craters, they're not random. They're forming a pattern. Harris squinted through the rain. What does it mean? I don't know, James admitted, but it's connected to the weapon. Maybe it's a signal or a map. If we can figure it out, we might be able to find the key." Before they could discuss further, a loud rumble shook the ground. James grabbed the edge of the observation post to steady himself as the earth trembled. The glowing craters pulsed with light, their energy intensifying. In the distance, a massive column of blue light erupted from the ground, shooting into the sky like a beacon. "It's happening," Harris whispered, his voice filled with dread. "The weapon, it's fully awake." James's mind raced. They were running out of time. If they didn't find the key soon, the weapon would consume everything. But how? Where could they even begin to look? As he stared at the column of light, an idea began to form. The pattern of craters, the glowing edges, it was a map leading to the key. If they could decipher it, they might be able to find the person connected to the weapon. "We need to get closer," James said, turning to Harris. "If we can reach the center of the pattern, we might find the key." Harris hesitated, his face pale. "Are you sure? That thing, it's dangerous." "We don't have a choice," James said firmly. "If we don't stop it, we're all dead anyway." Reluctantly, Harris agreed. They left the observation post and made their way down the hill, moving cautiously through the battlefield. The ground was unstable, the craters emitting a low hum that made James's teeth ache. As they approached the center of the pattern, the air grew colder, the blue light casting long shadows on the ground. When they reached the dark mound, James realized it wasn't just dirt. It was a structure, partially buried in the earth. The entrance to the underground chamber was still there, though the hatch had been blown open by the explosions. James peered inside, his flashlight revealing the same strange machinery he had seen before. The weapon was at the center, its surface glowing with the same blue light as the craters. "This is it," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The key has to be here." As they descended into the chamber, James noticed something he hadn't seen before. The walls were covered in symbols, similar to the ones on the weapon. They seemed to pulse with light, as if responding to the weapon's energy. James approached the control panel, his eyes scanning the strange language. One symbol stood out, a circle with a line through it, glowing brighter than the others. "What is that?" Harris asked, pointing to the symbol. "I don't know," James said, "but it's important. Maybe it's connected to the key." As he reached out to touch the symbol, the ground shook violently. The weapon's hum grew louder, the light intensifying. James stumbled back, his heart pounding. The weapon was reacting to him, as if it recognized his presence. "James!" Harris shouted, pointing to the entrance. "Look!" James turned, his blood running cold. The shadows in the chamber were moving, twisting and coalescing into humanoid shapes. They were faint, almost transparent, but their eyes glowed with the same blue light as the weapon. James realized with horror that they were the remnants of the soldiers who had died here, their souls trapped by the weapon's power. One of the shadows stepped forward, its form solidifying into the figure of a man. He was dressed in a tattered uniform, his face gaunt and pale. James recognized him immediately. It was Lieutenant Edward Hargrove. "You shouldn't have come here," Hargrove said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The weapon is awake, and it cannot be stopped." "We're trying to stop it," James said, his voice shaking. "We're looking for the key." Hargrove's expression softened. "The key? It's not what you think. It's not a person. It's a choice." "A choice?" James repeated, confused. Hargrove nodded. "The weapon feeds on energy, life energy. To destroy it, someone must sacrifice themselves, severing its connection to this world. That is the key." James felt a chill run down his spine. Sacrifice? Was that what Hargrove had meant? Was that the only way to stop the weapon? Before he could respond, the ground shook again, the weapon's light growing blinding. Hargrove's form began to fade, his voice barely audible over the hum. "You must decide," he said, "before it's too late." As Hargrove disappeared, James turned to Harris, his mind reeling. The key wasn't a person, it was a choice to give up his life to save countless others. Could he do it? Could he make that sacrifice? The weapon's light pulsed, its energy growing stronger. James knew he didn't have much time. He had to decide now. The sacrifice. The chamber was alive with energy, the weapon's hum growing louder and more intense with every passing second. The blue light pulsed like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows on the walls. James stood frozen, his mind racing. Hargrove's words echoed in his head. The key is a choice, a sacrifice. Harris grabbed his arm, his face pale and desperate. James, we have to get out of here. This thing, it's going to blow. James shook his head, his resolve hardening. No, if we leave, it'll destroy everything. Hargrove said the only way to stop it is to sever its connection to this world. Someone has to stay. Harris stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. You can't be serious. You're talking about dying. I'm talking about saving lives, James said firmly. If I don't do this, thousands, maybe millions, will die. You heard Hargrove. The weapon feeds on life energy. It'll keep growing, consuming everything, unless someone stops it. Harris opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He knew James was right. The weapon was too powerful, too dangerous. If it wasn't stopped now, it would be unstoppable. James turned back to the control panel, his hands trembling as he studied the symbols. The circle with the line through it still glowed brighter than the others. He didn't know what it meant, but he had a feeling it was the key, the final piece of the puzzle. If he could activate it, maybe he could destroy the weapon. Harris, you need to go, James said, his voice steady. Get as far away from here as you can. Harris hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. I can't just leave you here. You have to, James said, meeting his eyes. Someone needs to tell the others what happened. They need to know the truth about this weapon, about Hargrove, about everything. Promise me you'll do that. Harris swallowed hard, then nodded. I promise. James gave him a grim smile. Thank you. Now go. Harris turned and ran, disappearing up the stairs and into the night. James watched him go, then took a deep breath and turned back to the control panel. The weapon's hum was deafening now, the light so bright it hurt his eyes. He knew he didn't have much time. He reached out and pressed the glowing symbol. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground shook violently, the walls of the chamber cracking and crumbling. The weapon's light flared, and James felt a searing pain in his chest, as if something was being ripped out of him. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, as the weapon's energy surged through him. Images flashed before his eyes, memories of the war, of the men he had fought beside, of the lives that had been lost. He saw Hargrove and his unit, their faces filled with fear as the weapon consumed them. He saw the battlefield, littered with the bodies of soldiers who had died for nothing. And he saw the future, a world consumed by the weapon's power, a world of darkness and despair. But then he saw something else, a glimmer of hope, a world where the weapon was gone, where the war was over, where people could live in peace. It was a world worth fighting for, worth dying for. James clenched his fists, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He focused on the weapon, on its energy, on its connection to this world. He could feel it now, a vast, malevolent presence, feeding on his life force. But he also felt something else, a weakness, a flaw in its design. If he could exploit that flaw, he could destroy it. With a final, desperate effort, James reached out and grabbed the weapon. The pain was unbearable, but he didn't let go. He poured everything he had into it, his strength, his will, his very soul. The weapon's light flared one last time, then began to dim. The hum grew quieter, the energy fading. James felt himself slipping away, his body growing weaker. But he didn't care. He had done it. He had stopped the weapon. As the light faded completely, James collapsed to the ground, his vision darkening. The last thing he saw was the weapon, now silent and lifeless, its surface cracked and broken. And then there was nothing. The battlefield was quiet, the rain falling softly on the scarred earth. The craters were still there, but the blue light was gone, the weapon's energy extinguished. Soldiers moved through the trenches, their faces grim but relieved. The war was far from over, but for now, the immediate threat had passed. Harris stood at the edge of the trench, staring at the dark mound where the weapon had been buried. He had told the others what had happened, about James and the weapon and the sacrifice he had made. Some believed him, others didn't, but it didn't matter. The truth was out there, and that was enough. As Harris turned to leave, he noticed something on the ground. A small, leather-bound book, its cover stained and cracked. He picked it up, brushing away the dirt. It was Hargrove's diary. James must have dropped it during the final moments. Harris opened the diary, flipping through the pages. The entries were the same as before, but there was one new addition, a final note written in James's handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I've done what I had to do. The weapon is gone, but the war isn't. Don't let what happened here be forgotten. Tell the world the truth. And remember, sometimes the greatest weapon we have is the choice to do what's right." Harris closed the diary, his eyes filled with tears. He would honor James's sacrifice. He would make sure the world knew the truth. As he walked away, the rain began to clear, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. It was a new day, and though the war still raged, there was hope. Hope that one day the fighting would end and the world would be at peace. And it was all thanks to James, a soldier who had given everything to protect it.